Welcome. Today we're going to discuss the technique Entwined Maces and some of the more important principles, concepts, rules, theories, strategies, and a little bit of history you should know about the technique. So let's start out with the strategy like we normally do in our videos, because the strategy is pretty simple. We're going to be using continuous motion to overwhelm our opponent so they don't have time to respond or react to what we're doing. So let's see how that actually works out in the technique. We're dealing with an in-flight major, both the left and right punch combination. So how are we going to deal with this? Well, rule number one is to establish our base, but notice what we're going to be doing. We're going to be using path of travel rather than line of travel. So what I mean by that is we're going to be using the width of the weapon rather than the length of the weapon. I don't want to try to snake around the arms. Well, why? Why can't we just snake? Why do we want to do the path? Well, this brings in two other concepts. The plus X rule, because we want to make a plus or an X, and margin for error. Remember, I don't know where he's punching. I just know that he's punching because I identified the motion. This gives me more margin for error because of that. So to compensate, we want to make sure that we're using the path, keeping that elbow anchored. But this is where our strategy comes in, because from now on, we're going to be striking using that continuous motion so they don't have time to respond or react. They already had their two shots. It's time for us to do ours. We're going to be using opposing forces to pull them into this punch so that we start exposing this open-ended triangle, and we're now able to reverse the motion using contouring of the arm so that we can deliver the strike. But remember, we want to do continuous motion. So the way this is going to work is we're going to be doing quarter beat timing. So in other words, don't do one, then step, then hit, then step, then hit. Those are one beat timing. We want quarter beats. So as soon as I hit, everything is moving continuously. But let's break it down and actually talk about how that actually works. In this case, notice what we're doing with the hammer fist. We are using backup mass. We're moving in a line to deliver this in a line. So how does that work? Because if you notice, we're doing a circle. So the idea of how to create a line is to use multiple circles. In this case, the shoulder and then the elbow. If we combine them together with the line, we get to deliver this line. But notice that the line is being executed with backup mass. And it's interesting because if you notice, we're not in line with our body. Typically, backup mass has our body behind or in front of the weapon. Right now, it's next to it. Why? Well, because we're striking to a soft target, so we don't need to be in line to have the proper alignments. And because we're using directional harmony. If you notice, because of that continuous motion, everything's going in the same direction. But before we continue with the rest, this is going to bring up our history. There was an article written up in Black Belt magazine a long time ago from an individual who said that Kenpo was very effective at a far range, but that once you close the gap, it was no longer effective. And as you can imagine, this made Senior Grandmaster Parker very angry. Because if you understand American Kenpo, you know how ridiculous that statement was. And this is a prime example of that. So if you notice what we're doing, we have closed the gap on our opponent. We are very close, but we have 3 dimensions. We're only focused on the depth right now. We can change this to the height, and that's what we're doing here. So if you notice, just like at the beginning when we contoured the arm to take advantage of the open-ended triangle, we're now doing that contouring the body using our forearm to take advantage of that open-ended triangle. But that's only 2 dimensions. Where's the third? Well, that's the width. That would be this strike. So if you notice what we're doing, again, being closed, we are using the height and the width to effectively strike our opponent. But remember that anything we can do with our hands, we can do with our feet. So that's where the knee comes in. The knee wants to be using height rather than depth again. Because remember, we're close. So we're going to hit up. But the interesting thing to notice here is what we're doing here with this hand. Notice what we're doing. We're staying close because we're controlling the gap. In this case, by grabbing his gi. But what if he wasn't wearing a gi? What if we were at the beach and he was shirtless? Well, this brings in environment, consideration number 1, right? That's the first thing we got to think about. If he doesn't have a gi, where can I grab? Well, we can go for the ideal face, which grabs under the pec. But again, we're at the beach. He's wet. He's sweaty. I can't grab him there because he might slip. So using the formulation equation, just change your target. This could be something as easy as controlling him by grabbing to the throat. But the idea is to keep that gauge so that now we can choose to disengage and send them flying. So I know there's a follow-up maneuver for the ideal face of the technique, but this is going to bring in the concept of long-range version, middle version, and short versions. Remember, the techniques show us the long versions of the technique, but they're just showing you all the different options. So what I mean by that is if we go back to the beginning, and we're doing our technique, I could just as easily use that continuous motion to send it flying with the back kick rather than doing everything we did in the middle. But the interesting thing to keep in mind is why this is part of the technique. Well, if you notice, what we're doing is we are disengaging our opponent away from us. We have techniques where we're left in the middle of a fight. We have techniques where we disengage from the opponent. This is showing us what happens if we get our opponent away, but we need to re-engage. For instance, our environment. I have a closed environment, and the exit happens to be on that side. So I have to re-engage to continue to go the way that I want to go. So now that we talked about the rules, concepts, principles, theories, and a little bit of history, let's actually demonstrate it once fairly slow so you can see it executed. We hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system a little bit better. Thank you very much.